Grace and peace to you today. Our reading for today is from Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 15 through 20. It begins, "See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today, by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you do not hear, but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall perish, that you shall not live long in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life, so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him and holding fast to him. For that means life to you and length of days, so that you may live in the land that the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Here ends the reading. Deuteronomy is almost entirely a speech or a sermon that Moses gives to God's people as they are standing at the precipice of the promised land, when they are standing just on the outside looking in, full of hopeful anticipation. Moses uses this moment to remind them of what this opportunity really means, to remind them of their covenant with God and what being God's people means. Just before this section, Moses reminds them that God's law is not hard and it's not far from them, that they know it. And then here he tells them that as they enter into this promised land, that they have a choice. They can choose life and prosperity or death and adversity. That they can worship God and be in relationship with God, which brings with it life for them and generations to come. Or they can choose other gods, which brings with it death and turmoil because they are no longer connected with the God who created the world. While this is Moses' sermon to the Israelites, Deuteronomy was written down around the time that the Israelites were actually coming back to the same promised land after they'd been in exile. The folks hearing and reading Deuteronomy knew that the Israelites didn't remain faithful, didn't choose to worship only God, didn't choose life and prosperity, as Moses put it. And they saw the turmoil that was war and division and eventually exile. Moses was encouraging them to faithful living and covenant with God as they first entered into the promised land. And the writer of Deuteronomy was encouraging God's people to be faithful as they re-entered into this promised land after so much time in exile. Lutherans have often rejected simple dichotomies like the one Moses lifts up in our reading. For instance, instead of saying that we are saint or sinner, Luther claimed that we are both saint and sinner, both at the same time. There were and are varying ideas on this, but Luther seemed to believe that a person could never be completely sinless. Perhaps it was possible for them to not enact sinful actions, but they still would think them, still be tempted by them. Luther didn't seem to agree with Moses that God's law is easy to know and easy to follow. As complex as the world is today, and as many different teachings as there are even within Christianity, it isn't always easy to know what God's laws or hopes would be for us in every situation as we apply them today. Often even actions made with good intentions have unintended consequences on others. That doesn't mean that we can ignore Moses' preaching, however, and Jesus also makes some pretty stark demands on what our lives as disciples should look like, both in terms of relationship with God as well as how we treat one another. Our lives are full of decisions and choices that we make every day. What we eat, what we wear, what we buy, how we interact with other folks, how we use our time. If we only make these decisions based on our own wants and needs, then we will likely live a life that does ignore God and ignores our effects on other people. Some of those choices are clearly wrapped up in God's laws, particularly the Ten Commandments. For instance, in Luther's explanation of the Ten Commandments, he says that don't kill also means that we should work for the good of our neighbors, which means we're not so easily off the hook on that one. For don't lie, he says that we should also interpret what other people say in the best possible light, which these days, at least in public discourse, we are much more likely to interpret what others say in the worst possible light. Thankfully, there's grace for that. when we make these mistakes. And through Christ, we have the promise of the forgiveness of sins so that we can live anew and not be forever defined and weighed down by our actions, that we get to put down that old self and try to live each day anew as God calls us to live. But that doesn't mean we don't have to wrestle with our actions, because the harm that we do others through our actions is real harm. Moses and Jesus give us these demands on our actions because they care about us and they care about the people that we affect, and they want good for both. The commandments, God's rules, aren't arbitrary rules that God gives us to test us, but they are to help us be in good, healthy relationships with God and with each other, which is what we should want. And frankly, is what I believe the kingdom looks like now, removed from any specific geography. It looks like loving God, being loved by God, and having that love shape the way we love and treat our neighbors, working for their good, advocating for their well-being, and accepting and welcoming them as they are, because they are created in God's image and beloved by God, and knowing that they are doing the same for us. It isn't easy, and we're never going to get it perfectly right. But a life working for it and growing in it is a faithful life well lived. God's peace. I hope that this has been helpful for you, gives you some thoughts for the day. And if you have any conversations you want to have based on this, feel free to reach out. We'd be glad to do that with you. God's peace. Have a good day.